here's part 2, where we're going to talk about two-way ANOVAs and how they extend what we can do with just our basic one-way ANOVA. And we call them one-way ANOVAs because we only have one independent variable. So we've had situations so far where we're looking at one thing like blood pressure and wondering if it changes between groups, or aggression, if it changes with people of different eye colors, and things like that. So what we need to do now is get into the details about what happens when we throw in another one. So in other words, maybe I find that, right, eye color is related to aggression, but maybe it's different for men than it is for women. Maybe green-eyed women are aggressive, but brown-eyed men are aggressive, or something like that. And I can't do that necessarily. I can't combine things unless I have another tool that lets me do that, and that's what a two-way ANOVA does. So we're going to talk about main effects, we're going to talk about interactions, and we're going to use a little chocolate example that I have. And so say that, I want to up my game in life, and I'm tired of eating this cheap chocolate. I really like the good stuff, or I think I'm going to like the good stuff. And the question is it really worth it? And when I lived in Arizona for a while, my wife worked at Godiva Chocolatier, and basically she could get whatever she wanted and take home whatever she wanted, like every day. She put on a pound of chocolate every month, she said, while she worked there. And I probably did the same, because their chocolate is really good, and she got cookies and fruit, and it was fantastic. But I would never wish that upon myself, because it was also deadly. But anyway, so the question is there really a difference between cheap and expensive chocolate? Now, I can look at this and say I take a survey of people and I give them chocolate to eat, and it's either cheap or expensive. And I get the tastiness ratings for the cheap chocolate. I get the tastiness ratings for the expensive chocolate. I run my ANOVA, and I'm just going to make it bigger so you can see it better, right? And in this output, it's a little bit different. I'm going to ignore the intercept and the total down here, but I look at my sum of squares, right? And I find that the brand of chocolate is my effect that I'm looking at. And that corresponds with a p-value over here that is less than 0.05. So I am going to say that yes, the expense or the cost of a chocolate makes a difference. Now, suppose though I had another hypothesis, and I wanted to know, well, is this the same for milk chocolate and dark chocolate, or is there just a preference between milk and dark in general? And so if I have this question about, is there a difference in the tastiness of milk chocolate and dark chocolate? I give out milk chocolate, I give out dark chocolate, I have people give tastiness ratings. And just by looking at the data, I can see that it looks like the milk chocolate ratings are a little bit higher, but there's a lot of overlap. And so I don't know if they're really going to be different. If I run my ANOVA, I get my results. Again, I'm going to be ignoring, I'm going to make this a little bit fatter. I'm going to be ignoring these top things. Well, it doesn't get much bigger than this. And I'm really just going to be looking at the type of chocolate. I have my F value, I have my P value. Because this P value is bigger than 0.05, I'm going to fail to reject the null and say that doesn't matter if it's milk or dark. Tastiness is kind of the same. Now, suppose though, instead of running those analyses separately, cheap versus expensive and milk versus dark, I combine them. And instead of having just pairs of things, I now have this grid of cheap dark versus cheap milk versus expensive dark versus expensive milk. Because maybe, just maybe, expensive only matters if I'm talking about dark chocolate. Or maybe expensive only matters if I'm talking about milk chocolate. Or maybe it doesn't matter at all. And I have to be able to figure those things out. So if I do that, and I run my analysis, I will have in SPSS 3 different variables. One will be brand, one will be type, and one will be tastiness. And for each person, I say whether it's cheap or expensive, whether it's milk or dark, and then I get the tastiness rating. And what I will get here is two independent variables. I will have a brand effect, mainly again this is the effect of whether or not it's cheap or expensive. I will have the type, whether it's milk or dark effect. And you can see now, and I interpret these effects in the same way. So what I have here is I have a brand effect, meaning that there is a difference. There's a main effect in general. Expensive is going to be better than cheap. And I also have a type effect as well, where my milk is going to be better than my dark. If I look at one other thing, I have a brand by type source here. And that is my brand by type interaction. And that means if there is a difference between cheap and expensive, is it the same for milk as it is for dark? If it is the same, then my p-value will be what it is here. It'll be 1. It'll be really big. If the effect of the cost of chocolate, whether it's cheap or expensive, is different for milk than it is for dark, then I would have a larger value here. My f value would be bigger, and my p-value would be smaller. And if it's less than 0.05, then I reject the null. And so I really have 3 different hypotheses that I'm testing. One is the A main effect, and in this case, is there a difference between brands? 2 is the B main effect. Is there a difference between types? And 3 is the A by B interaction, meaning, is the effect of cost the same for milk and dark? Likewise, is the effect of type, milk or dark, the same for cheap as expensive? And each of these makes up a family of tests when I think of family-wise error. So it's not like I'm committing 3 tests in the family-wise error sense. I'm not worried that I'm going to have more or too many false positives. I'm going to be okay in that regard. These are notes on how to do it. If I look at graphs, and it's always easier to look at this stuff if I look at graphs, what I'm really doing when I'm comparing brand is I'm averaging across the cheap. And so I have my cheap milk and my cheap dark. And I take the average of those two right here. It's this line. Then I take the average of the expensive ones, and that's this line. And I compare, is this line different than this line? And obviously it is. If I do it the other way, I have cheap and expensive on this. And so now I'm comparing, in both cases, I have my dark chocolate here and my milk chocolate. So I'm comparing the average of the milk versus the average of the dark. And they're different. Even though that difference is not as big as it was here, they're still different, as evidenced by my output here, My brand effect, 0.000, less than 0.05. My type effect, less than 0.05 as well. The last thing is the interaction of brand and type. And basically what I'm doing is saying, is the difference between the lines of milk and dark here the same as it is here? If it is the same, there is no interaction. If it's different, then there is. Let's see, I think I'm going to skip over this part, so if you have notes, you don't need to worry about this. So if I want to spend a little more time talking about interactions, I can use another sample. And same idea, cheap and expensive, dark versus milk, but just looking at them now, If I'm looking at cheap versus expensive, well, my cheap chocolates are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for tastiness ratings. My expensive chocolates are also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In other words, I get the exact same ratings for cheap chocolates as I do for expensive chocolates. If I compare it on dark versus milk, for dark chocolates I have ratings of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And for milk I have ratings of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so I don't have any difference between my dark and my milk. The question is the difference between this group and this group, the same as it is for this group and this group. And we'll see what that looks like in a minute. If I run this analysis, what I see, oops, I gotta move this, well, I'll move this up. What I see is that for brand, right, I have an F of 0 because there was no difference, p-value of 1. I failed to reject the null, brand doesn't make a difference. The type, or whether it's milk or dark, also 0. P-value is well over 0.05, as big as you can get, doesn't make a difference. However, I do have an interaction, meaning that the effective brand actually exists, it's just different for whether I'm talking about milk chocolates or dark chocolates. So, let me move this off out of the way. In this case, right, if I'm looking at my milk chocolates and I'm looking at my dark chocolates, when I'm talking about cheap chocolates, right, basically what this says is that with cheap chocolates, you should, well, I should say with dark chocolates, my blue line, you should spend the money because actually people tend to prefer expensive dark chocolates by a lot to cheap dark chocolates. However, if you're talking about milk chocolates, it doesn't make sense to spend more money because actually the cheap stuff is better than the expensive stuff. This is made up data to make a point. Expensive chocolate in general is better than cheap chocolate, in my opinion. So you can't go wrong. It just comes down to how much you actually want to spend. But this is what an interaction looks like. And interactions can take other forms as well. The idea is that the lines themselves are not parallel, right? And so I'm comparing these 2 points to these 2 points. And even though the distance is the same, the direction is different. In this case, right, milk, when I'm talking about cheap chocolates, milk is better than dark. When I'm talking about expensive chocolates, dark is actually better than milk. So the effect of whether milk or dark is better depends on whether I'm talking about cheap chocolates or expensive chocolates. In this case, if I'm looking at this, right, it looks like spending money on milk chocolates pays big dividends, but spending money on expensive chocolates doesn't do anything. There's no difference for cheap chocolates between milk and dark, but there's a huge difference when we're talking about expensive chocolates. Likewise, same thing here, no difference for cheap, very high ratings for both, but a big difference where expensive dark keeps that high rating, but expensive milk is for some reason really bad. Last one is here where the lines don't really cross or touch, but the difference between milk and dark here is a lot smaller than the difference between milk and dark here. Note this, if you're ever looking at graphs, make sure you look at the scale of measurement on the side. This is something we talked about when we talked about graphing stuff. Graphing packages always exaggerate the differences to make the graph look as big as possible, so I always have to rescale things. Ultimately, right, you want to be able to, or I want you to be able to, and let me go back to this, be able to interpret this output and interpret the graph in words. And there's a worksheet online that I'll want you to do. The answers are also online, and so there's no reason why you shouldn't do really well on it, but make sure you understand exactly what I'm asking and what I want you to do. Look at the practice exam, take some time, make sure you feel comfortable with this stuff. The last situation occurs then when we were going to practice, but we obviously don't have time. The last situation comes up when, well, what if I don't just have like 2 categories? What if I have, say, 3 categories? And so now I have a lot more cells. I have cheap dark, mid-range dark, expensive dark, cheap milk, mid-range milk, and expensive milk. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different groups. If I run the analysis, I find the following, right? If I look at brand, I have significant brand effect, so expense matters. I don't know if it pays off to go to mid-range or if I have to go to the expensive stuff or what. That's something I have to figure out with post-hoc tests, so it's after the fact t-tests. When I look at type, Oh, I have an effect there as well, right? So milk and dark matter. When I talk about the brand by type interaction, it says there isn't one, meaning that the effect of expensive versus cheap is the same regardless of whether we're talking about milk or dark. Likewise, whether we're talking about when we're talking about the difference between milk and dark, it's the same at all different cost levels. If I want to, then I need to do some follow-up tests to try to figure out where the differences are, and it would just look like it did before, right? For the brand effect, I need to figure out if there's a difference between the cheap and the mid-range, the cheap and the expensive, or the mid-range and the cheap. And the way I do that is just by running my post-hoc tests. You may have to look at this. And I find that cheap and mid-range, there's a little bit of difference, but my p-value is not less than 0.05. So I say there's no difference between cheap and mid-range. However, there is a difference between cheap and expensive because my p-value is 0.000, less than 0.05. So I say that there's a difference between cheap and expensive. Is there a difference between mid-range and expensive? Well, yes, there is. So it seems, if I were to look at a graph, right, that there's not much difference here between the cheap and the mid-range. In other words, if I really want to get some really good chocolate, I kind of got to go with the expensive stuff. There's no real return in just spending a little more. If I want good chocolate, I have to spend a lot more. Notice that this is before rescaling the graph. This is after. Doesn't look as severe, but it still is a meaningful difference. And I can look at this in multiple ways. Suppose that I run this analysis again, and I get this. Oops, too big. I get this particular output. In this case, I have a brand effect. Oh, this is the wrong one. My bad. Sorry. Hold on. Gotta find the right one. Here we go. Suppose that I have this situation where I have a brand effect, I have a type effect, but I also have a brand by type interaction. And again, I'm always looking at the p-values. We'll talk about what this is, I think, in class next time. But it basically is the same as r squared. If I look at the graphs for these, right, I see that the difference is consistent between milk and dark as I go from cheap to mid-range, but when I go to expensive, they flip, but it looks like there's really no difference, right? I can graph this another way and say, look at the difference in expense or in the amount of money I spend for milk and dark. And I see that for milk, it looks like money doesn't matter, right? And if I look at this milk line, all the points are pretty close. If I'm looking at dark, there's a small return, but not a real significant return if I spend a little more on dark, but I should spend a lot more on the dark if I want really good chocolate. What this all tells you then is that if you're the only time you would ever want to spend extra money is if you want really good dark chocolate. Otherwise, if you don't really care if it's that good, or if you're getting milk chocolate, it doesn't pay to spend the money. And this is going to help us understand multiple regression as well, and it really helps us understand the world, because the real world is complicated. There's never just a pure, straightforward answer. There's always a caveat, a condition, and the right answer is always, well, it depends. What type of therapy is the best for this kid? Well, it depends. What are the goals? What are his parents like? What is his home environment like? What are the other things that are going on with him? What's the most effective safety procedure to implement, or policy to implement here? Well, it depends. What type of factory is it? How educated are the workers? What's the overall health level? What's the overall cost? And so on. And this allows us, when we get all these it depends in there, we get a much more precise and intelligent way of viewing the world. So what I want you to do is take a look at this stuff and make sure that you can answer the questions on the practice test. Make sure that you can answer the questions on the practice worksheets that are on there's one worksheet on D2L. Some of the answers are completed for you. So that should be it. I will send out maybe some more instructions in an email. Maybe one more video too, a short one about interpreting research. See you next week.